summarize your seminar and highlight your main argument.
Well, basically what I'm talking about today is war and international politics. And what I want to focus on is great power war and international politics. And my basic argument is that the most important element in international relations is war. It sits there in the background, and it is the dominant influence on how policymakers think about the world, and it is also of tremendous importance in explaining how great powers interact with each other.
In the first section of your paper, War and International Politics, you discuss how the possibility of great power war is a dominating feature of international politics and profoundly impacts how policymakers think about the world. You mention that states pay great attention to the danger of war, particularly in the modern nuclear era. How is the calculus of the possibility or threat of war altered when aggressor states are led by people who seem less rational or are non-nuclear states?
Well, the fact is, I think it's very rare for states to be led by individuals who are not rational. It occasionally happens, but I think for the most part, leaders are rational. With regard to non-nuclear states, I think the fact is that great powers are axiomatically nuclear states. So in my talk and in the paper that I have written for the talk, the focus is invariably on nuclear states. And my argument is that you want to think long and hard about the relationship between war and international politics, because war, when it involves great powers, involves nuclear armed states. And if things go wrong with nuclear armed states, we could all end up getting incinerated. So I think war and politics, war and international politics is a tremendously important subject in a non-nuclear world, to get to your question, but it's even more important in a nuclear world.
Moving to the second section, you examine war as a tool of statecraft and juxtapose the limitations posed by international law and just war theory with a state's fears for survival. If states are much more likely to act when they feel threatened rather than waiting for international law to give them a legal or moral permission for war, why does international military law still exist? And does its existence, even if only in theory, provide a sort of reassurance that states are inclined to act morally?
Well, I think when you talk about international military law, you're talking more about the conduct of war than initiating war. There are two dimensions to international law and two dimensions to just war theory. The first dimension has to do with initiating war. The second dimension has to do with the conduct of war. And I think that most military law deals with the conduct of war. And I think the fact is that if a war breaks out, you want to go to great lengths to have norms and to have rules that encourage states to behave in a moral or ethical way. Most importantly, to not purposely kill civilians. Are these laws or norms going to work in profound ways in all cases? The answer, sadly, is no.
Focusing on the last section of your paper, you argue that war must be kept subordinated to politics to avoid escalation into total war, particularly in this nuclear age. In cases where one or both belligerent states are allied with a great power, how can those great powers practice limited war and curb escalation while still honoring their commitments to their weaker allies and protecting that ally's survival?
This is a great question because when a great power that's armed with nuclear weapons has an ally, right, it wants to make sure that that ally does not have nuclear weapons of its own. Because if that ally has nuclear weapons of its own, it can hit another country with its nuclear weapons and drag that great power into a nuclear war. So the United States, to be more specific, does not want any of its allies to have a finger on a nuclear weapon, right, or a nuclear trigger, because the great fear is that that ally will use that nuclear weapon against another great power, and that will cause that great power to hit the United States. However, those allies of the United States understand the importance of nuclear deterrence, and therefore they depend on the United States, or a great power more generally, to provide them with nuclear deterrence. The United States, as we like to say, puts its nuclear umbrella over countries like Germany, countries like Japan and South Korea. And the argument there is that if nuclear weapons have to be used in the defense of our allies, we'll decide when to use them or not. Our allies fear that we won't use them because of the fear of escalation into a general thermonuclear war. But nevertheless, we go to great lengths to make sure they don't acquire nuclear weapons because, to go back to my original point, an ally with a finger on the trigger is not in our national interest.
Thank you. Moving to the final question now. Your recent book with NDISC affiliate Sebastian Rosado claims that the rational decisions in international politics rest on credible theories about how the world works and emerge from a deliberate decision-making process. At what point do national myths or legacies become non-credible sources for a policymaker determining what their state's place in the world, or even region, should be?
I believe that nationalism is the most powerful ideology on the planet. And I think that nationalism involves myths. There's no question about that. When you look at nationalist histories, right, they're filled with myths. The interesting question that you raise is whether when policymakers or leaders are making important foreign policy decisions, those myths influence how they think and how they act. And if they did influence how policymakers think and act, that would not be rational. Because Sebastian and I argue that rational decision-making involves employing credible theories and staying away things from nationalist myths. What we find is there is little evidence that nationalist myths are actually at play in the policy-making process at the highest levels. This is not to deny for 1 second that they matter enormously in the broader public. But we see little evidence that those nationalist myths undermine rationality inside the decision-making room.